Good morning, everyone. Welcome to day 2 of Bilingualism and Executive Function. We're starting with a session on young adults, and our first speaker will be Albert Costa from the University of Pompeu in Spain. He is a research professor in social and behavioral sciences, an expert in bilingual speech production and neuroimaging techniques. In 2012-2013, his group published 20 articles on the relation between bilingualism and executive control in young adults and patients with Alzheimer's disease. Our second speaker will be Raymond Klein from Dalhousie University in Canada. He's the university research professor at the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience. He is an expert in human performance and applied cognitive psychology. And with Hilchi, he published the first paper summarizing the evidence on the relationship between bilingualism and cognitive control. The commentator is Theo Marinas from the University of Reading. He's professor of multilingualism and language development, and his research focuses on first and second language acquisition in typically developing children, children with SLI, and children with ASD. He uses a range of offline and online measures to address the development of language processing across populations and to address the relationship between language and cognition. So we will start with Albert.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here. And thank you, the organizers, for having invited me to attend to this, I think, very exciting and timely conference on the issue of how bilingualism relates to executive control functions. So my talk today is going to be basically an experimental talk. I won't talk that much about theory, and in part it's because the more I grow, the less theoretical I become. That perhaps is not a wise step, but that's the way I feel. So I'm going to present some of the results that we've been gathering in Barcelona, in other parts of Europe, involving also Italy and also other parts of Spain. And as you will see, the story, as you may imagine, is a bit more complicated than we expected when we start looking at the relationship between bilingual language control and executive control. All right. So this is the question that we try to answer, right? So which are the common mechanisms between domain general executive control and bilingual language control? So how do bilinguals actually manage to handle the two languages, and to what extent that resorts on executive control processes, or to what extent that resorts on processes that are mostly language related, right? So processes that are independent to some degree of executive control domain general processes. So this is that's as much theory I have, right? Which is kind of it's very sketchy and very silly. But the idea would be by using experimental brute force, trying to determining which processes are shared by these two components. And we do that by following this approach. We explore the associations and dissociations in linguistic and non-linguistic tasks that supposedly share a common mechanism. And we do that by looking at single case studies of neurological compromised patients, healthy adults, patients with cognitive impairments, functional overlap at the brain level, and differences between bilinguals and monolinguals in switching tasks. That's what I will present today. Now, I know that many people here have done a lot of work on that, and that's one of the reasons, in part, that it's very hard for me to keep track of what is being published, despite the fact that I review quite a few of those studies. But nevertheless, it's very hard to keep track. So I'm going to stick to most of the talk, I'm going to stick to what we did. So I apologize in advance. Now, recently we have published a review paper in which we make our points about what we think is going on in this domain and other domains related to bilingualism. That is, if you don't want to start reading all these experimental papers, you can go there and you will have a summary of our views on this issue. Okay, I'm going to give you the answer. That's my mother always tells me that I should give the answer before going on, just in case people want to have coffee and don't, waste their time for 30 minutes or 40 minutes here. So the answer is the following. We think that the link between bilingual language control and domain executive control is an elusive one, especially if you look at behavioral measures. Okay, and yesterday we had here very interesting talks about how to approach executive control functions. Interesting and at the same time, I would say troublesome in the sense that, they told us how difficult that is. And my experience, again, in terms of experimental approaches, this is what we think that this link is an elusive one, and we should keep trying, doing smarter experiments, I guess. Now, also, it is difficult to find associations across tasks, and sometimes language control and executive control clearly dissociate, especially in impaired individuals. Okay, and I'll show today some of those cases. But, and here is the problem, or adds complexity to the issue. The neuroimaging data suggests some sort of overlap and some differences between monolinguals and bilinguals in the networks involved in executive control, right? So, there has to be someone smarter than me to come and put all of this together and see what we can get out of it. All right, so let's start with single case studies, and let me introduce you this case of this Catalan-Spanish bilingual person, 44 years old. She was born with the two languages, so she was using the two languages. She was a professor at the university, and she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and she got referred to us by actually her daughter. That she said, my mother has always spoke to me in Catalan, and now she starts to speak Spanish, and she gets stuck into Spanish, right? So let me give you an example of her performance, because you go to the neuropsychological when you go to the neuropsychological handbooks on bilingualism, you always find all these different types of damage of the two languages, and we have been exploring many, many patients. It's true that most of them from Catalan and Spanish, and it was very hard to find any clear dissociation, and this is one of the few we found, and we think that has to do with language control. Don't worry, you don't need to know Catalan or Spanish, it's translated.
A veure, aquest dibuix, em sembla que és una cuina. Veig una senyora que està netejant la cuina, els plats y els estris de la cuina. A la izquierda hay dos niños. Uno está subido a un taburete, el otro una niña que lo está mirando de abajo. El niño que está en el taburete está cogiendo galetas o cookies de un pote que hay arriba. Nada más. Ay, perdó, ho sento. És que canvio català-castellà, jo feia català i ja s'ha hablat en castellano. Us deia que aquest dibuix veig una cuina. En la cuina hi ha una senyora que està haciendo limpieza, està fent neteja dels estris de la cuina, está limpiando un plato. A la pica té molta aigua. Presto a limpiar todo lo que hay al lado. Platos, vasos, limpieza de cocina. En català, ui, por Dios. I llavors a l'esquerra hi ha un taburet, un nen a sobre que está cogiendo galetas de una estantería que hay ahí. Encima ya
I guess you get the idea, right? This person cannot keep track of the language she's supposed to speak. Nevertheless, the fluency is relatively well. Now, we tend to have many bilingual conversations in Barcelona, but trust me, this is not the common pattern. You really have to make an effort to do this unless you are doing it because you cannot keep track of the language you're speaking. All right. All right. So we test this person in several tasks, and here you have her performance in this task, right? She was switching up, producing more words when she was asked to speak in Catalan and in Spanish, and there was not a difference. I mean, this person, the first language was actually Catalan. Now we test her in some language switching tasks, very simple tasks, and as compared to controls, she seems to be impaired, especially in the switch condition. And true enough, when we test her in the non-linguistic tasks, she also is impaired as compared to controls. So, the patient was impaired both in linguistic and non-linguistic switching as compared to controls. Well, it's an association, so you would say, to the extent that the system is damaged for both tasks. But, associations in neuropsychology are not the most informative information. The most informative information is dissociations. As something happened, if you go back to the literature, you have this speaker, right, this Benetton Italian speaker with subcortical aphasia, that she had a bunch of problems controlling language, but they don't report the numbers, but you have to trust what they say. So it's noteworthy that blah had no troubles in this switching in regular Wisconsin, I think it was Wisconsin card sorting test, which suggests that the patient fixation behavior is mostly linguistic in nature. So here you have a dissociation between language control and domain general executive control. I'm not going to present more cases like this because there are not that many cases that have been explored, in detail. And just give you a type of evidence that could be important to try to understand to what extent bilingual language control dissociates for executive control processes. All right. So let's move to healthy adults. And here we have been using quite a bit the language switching task and the non-linguistic switching task in different types of instantiations. And I'm not going to go into the details, just basically the general ones that you know about already. And here is what we find with these young adults, Spanish Catalan. We asked them to switch between L1 and L3, which is English, to look for whether we could find an asymmetrical switch cause, namely larger cause for L1 than for the weaker language, L3. And, we didn't, that's a result that we reported already 10 years ago, that when you test high proficient bilinguals, you don't seem to have asymmetrical language cause when you do the task in L1 and L3. Okay, and I know there are other results there, a bit conflicting with this idea, but that's what we keep finding. Despite this, we did have a non-linguistic switch cause in this task. The tasks are comparable to the extent that they can be comparable. There are many differences in terms of number of items, but that's what we did. So what more interesting, what we try to look is at the correlation between the tasks, right? And to the extent that these processes share anything, you expect to find some correlation. I know this is very naive, but my education is in psycholinguistics, not in executive control, and we did this naive approach that I think many people have done, and we didn't find any correlation between these two tasks. Now we look also a larger sample. In this larger sample of about 60 people, we didn't find any correlation between the cause either. And there is another phenomenon called N-2 effect that we will be discussing later, that it's some people have argued that this M-2 cost, I'll tell you later what it is the best index of inhibition. And here we didn't find any if correlation either between language switching and non-linguistic task switching. Okay. So, to the extent that these correlations are meaningful in any way, we seem to find some dissociation, or we don't seem to find a correlation between the two tasks. However, there are other studies, and these are studies by Golan, Sandoval, and Savon, in which they look at cognitive decline, okay, and proportion of cross-language intrusions in the verbal fluency task. And I want to point out a couple of things. One of them is that cross-language intrusions seem to increase with age. However, the proportion is 0.01. That's very little intrusions. So my reading of this is that language control actually survives quite well across the lifespan. All right? So it's not that you have an increase in this 0.01. It's not 0.1. It's not 10%. Okay? Now, in this task, what they did is they look at errors in the flanker task and proportion of cross-language intrusions. And the idea was the same one. So people that would be compromised in executive control as measured by the flanker task, the errors in the flanker task, they will show larger proportion of cross-linguistic errors. Now, that is true, but if you pay attention a bit here, a proportion of errors on flanker task in incongruent trials, this guy, for instance, makes 100% of errors. Right? These guys here. So basically, the idea is that you make 50%. If you make 50% of errors, you're doing the task randomly. Right? Just right, left. And despite making so many errors, the intrusions are very few. Okay? So my reading of this, and I talked to Tamar for a while, my reading of this is that actually the two effects dissociate. That you can have many, many errors in the flanker task and be very, very good in speech control. Now, we were inspired by this paper, and I mean, sometimes with Golan, I do have this feeling that either we copy what she does or she copies what we do. Basically, we have the same mindset, I guess, so we do things in parallel. We try to look at how the decline of executive functions relate to the decline of bilingual language control. And here we tested young, middle-aged, and elderly. And you have, to some extent, an effect of age in the non-linguistic switch cost. So the elderly you get, the larger the switch cost you get. Okay? And surprisingly enough, in the bilingual language control mechanism, that is the linguistic switch cost, we don't have that effect. It seems that age affects executive control processes to a larger extent than bilingual control process, language control processes. Okay? This was kind of surprising. All right. So we look again at the correlations between the two tasks. Young adults, no correlation between non-linguistic and linguistic switch cost. Middle age, no correlation. Elderly, this is just noise. You put all of them together and you don't find anything. Okay? And here you start having a sample that is about 60 people, so you do have more power to get something out of it, if there is anything, actually. All right. So what we know from healthy adults is that it's hard to find a correlation between the two tasks, and it's hard to find a common mechanism behind it. What about patients with cognitive impairments? So here we did a study with Alzheimer patients that were mild to moderate, and here each dot corresponds to the performance, to the degree of cognitive decline and the performance in picture naming, right? So you have black is when they name in the dominant language, white is when they name in the non-dominant language. Mm-hmm. Is this clear? It's just when you get results from patients, at least that's the way I was trained, ask for single data points. You don't look at the average only. Look at the whole spectrum because patients are very variable, and then when you look at the average, you get an average and you get a standard deviation, but you don't know how the single patients behave, and that's an important thing. So as you can see, the decline in the two languages is very similar. Okay, and yesterday I heard someone, I think there was the talk that was broadcast, saying that there are some studies suggesting that the decline of the two languages are different in, there might be some studies, but we keep finding always more or less the same decline. And these people were about 80 years old, so they had experience for about 60 years with the two languages, so they were kind of high proficient bilinguals. And more importantly, we look at the cross-language intrusions, and here the first thing you can see is all these guys here. Right? And this accounts for about 1% of errors. So again, the number of cross-language intrusions go in the same direction. So the worse you are in terms of cognitive decline, the more language intrusions you have, the same pattern for the two languages. But what is remarkable is that very few intrusions. Let's skip this. This is a bit difficult. Okay, so what we're going to look here is another sort of patients with Parkinson's disease that in principle they seem to have specific troubles with executive control processes, right? So one of the things that we were criticized looking at Alzheimer's patients is that, well, Alzheimer's patients at some stage of the disease, they are not so much compromised in terms of executive control, they are more compromised in terms of episodic memory and semantic memory. So you should go to patients that are compromised at the level of executive control. So we went to these type of patients, Parkinson patients, and we test them in different tasks. So again, we are not very original, right? So single blocks of naming in a single block or mixed blocks and looking at what is the pattern of performance. We do have mixing costs, as you know, is just subtracting repeated trials from single trials in the mixed block, and then switch cost is the local switch cost. Repeat versus switch trials. And according to some people, one of those costs would reveal the processes involved in sustained attention or global attention, and then the switch cost will reveal processes involved in transient attention. Yeah, that sounds nice. I don't know if it's true, but sounds good. Okay, so here it is. So here you have these patients. Unfortunately, we only have about 30 patients. And again, the linguistic switch cost did not correlate at all with the non-linguistic switch cost, even in these patients. However, the mixing cost did correlate, right? And it was a very strong correlation. So sticking to the standard view of how to interpret this evidence, one would claim that the overlap between the bilingual language control and the executive control system is for the abilities of the sustained control, but not for those of the transient control. So it's keeping track of what you're doing and not so much switching in short periods of time. And interestingly, the patient that I presented at the beginning, she was not that bad at doing language switch. I mean, she was impaired, but she was not that bad at doing language switch as long as you remind her every single item in which language she should be saying that item. So if you remind her this picture in Spanish, this picture in Catalan, this picture is Catalan, this picture in Spanish, she was relatively okay, right? Now, when she was free to speak is when she was mixing languages. So it's like if she had an impairment here and not so much there. In the sense of sustained attention and not so much of transient attention. Now, we are not the first to report that. And as you can see, this is a study also by Pryor and Golem, and they found the same things. No correlations between linguistic switch cost and domain general executive control in switching costs, and a clear correlation in mixing costs. All right. So you are wondering, why are you here to hear the correlations are not significant? That's our work. That's what we have done. I mean, we would like to have these results in a different way, but that's what we got. So the conclusion of this is that bilingual language control and executive control mechanisms seem to be partially overlap, no correlation between linguistic and non-linguistic switch costs, and some correlation for the mixing costs, suggesting some sort of overlap at the sustained attention. Now let's go to data from neuroimaging, and here things get even a bit more confusing. So the question we have here is, the language network involved differently when controlling linguistic and non-linguistic representations. And I'm going to present this study that Judy Kroll discussed yesterday briefly. This is a study in which we ask monolinguals to do a language switch task, well, not language, a linguistic switch task. So we ask them to name pictures, name the name of the object or the verb that goes with that object. So you have broom or you have sweeping, right? Depending on the color of the pictures. This is kind of odd, I must say, but it's a way for them to switch in the context of linguistic, in the linguistic context. And what we got here, many areas, but one of them was this area, cingulate cortex, that was more active when people switch than when people stay. And it was the same area, more or less, when we asked bilinguals to switch between languages. Now, interestingly enough, these people also did a flanker task, and the area they responded, there was certain overlap between the cingulate cortex, in the cingulate cortex for flanker conflict and for language switching. So suggesting that this cingulate area, it is involved to some extent in both bilingual language control and executive control functions. Now, this area has been, there are many interpretations of what this brain area does, but some people claim that it's related to conflict monitoring or to keep track of situations. So that will be more related to a sustained control rather than transient control, so to speak. All right, this is a more complex study that we perform, trying to see what happens when you repeat pictures, when you repeat the stimuli, and you do have to do a different task on that stimuli. So we present pictures that you have to name in L1, for instance, and then pictures that you have to name in L2. This is, Judy Kroll was also yesterday presenting some results related to this issue. And then we have tasks in which you have to say whether pictures are bigger than a shoebox, and then in the next block, you have to say whether those pictures are smaller than a shoebox. So you have to give a different response and different criteria of answering depending on the block, right? So basically, it's one of those psychological perversions that we try to confuse people. That's one of these cases. And then we did that in the context of, in the language context, or in a more semantic language-free semantic task. And true enough, there was some overlap in some areas between the two tasks, okay? So you have left prefrontal cortex is activated in both tasks, more for pictures that are repeated than for pictures that are not repeated, those that create most of the conflict. And there's also another area that responds to these control processes, both in language context and in semantic control context. Is this clear, the paradigm? So basically, we are testing difficult responses versus relatively easy responses, and we look at which brain areas light up, both when the task involves language or when it involves semantic classification. However, there were certain areas that didn't have an overlap, right? So we have right prefrontal cortex triangularis that respond only to language control, and the orbitalis part of this right prefrontal cortex responded only to semantic control. So, again, there seems to be an overlap. There are certain dissociations that are worth exploring. Okay, that's what I said. Now, there's a problem here. The ACC is not consistently reported as involved both in language control and domain general executive control, right? That's one of the problems we had. So to some extent, the task was different, but to some extent, we didn't replicate our previous studies with Jubin. You know, you don't know what to do out of it. Now, the left prefrontal cortex seems to be similarly involved in language control and executive control tasks. All right, now, how much time do we have? All right, so let me finish with this part of another way to look at this, the relationship between bilingual language control and executive control is, again, to look at the difference between bilingual and monolinguals and to what extent bilingual language control is affecting executive control processes. Whether that's an advantage or disadvantage, that's, you know, I don't care anymore about that, but I care to see whether there is an effect as a result of this crosstalk. And we focus again in the task switching, and again, we did a single block, a mixed block in task switching, just basically following prior and McWinney results and triangular results. Let me walk through the results. So this is switch cost. You do have a difference between bilinguals and monolinguals in the magnitude of the switch cost. And this effect is much smaller, if any, in the mixing cost. That's what they found. Now, however, a year after, they couldn't find a replication of these effects with different sorts of bilinguals. There didn't seem to be a difference between switch cost, neither mixing cost. Now, I'm going to skip this. You can ask me about what they did afterwards, but it was a bit of, I think, a bit of cherry picking to end up getting an effect for some part of the bilinguals. All right, so this is what we got, okay? So here we did a straight replication of what they did, and we basically replicate their second study, but not their first study. So we replicate the absence of difference between bilinguals and monolinguals in local switch costs and in mixing costs. But we were stubborn, right? And what we did is a long study, large study in which we test 3 different task switching paradigms and with many subjects. So here we have about 300 participants split by bilinguals and monolinguals. Now, let me tell you, these experiments are difficult for us because we don't have monolinguals in Barcelona. You know, we do have to go to other places, and this creates a problem. Because the best place to go is Madrid, right? Because Madrid, in many respects, is similar to Barcelona. True, they don't have the sea. True, they don't have Barca. That's a problem. And they don't have Messi either. You know, in many respects, it's just very similar. Now, we don't always go to Madrid. Sometimes go to other parts of Spain, which, you know, cities are small, you know. But that's as good as it gets. So but we have to pay for having a bilingual society in which it's very hard to find monolinguals. So we don't have a problem with immigration in this sense. Our bilinguals are not immigrants, but we don't have monolinguals. So this is kind of costly. And what I'm showing here is the CTC score and the number of participants at different intervals for bilinguals. And what would you expect is to have, you know, the monolingual curve either here or there. If there is a difference, it's just basically the same, right? So we don't have any difference between the two groups. So with this data, we argue that the local switch cost doesn't seem to be affected by bilingualism, at least in our sample. Now, this paper is very nice. This paper is very nice by Anat Pryor because they show a larger cost for bilinguals than for monolinguals because the task involved, according to them, inhibition, and that's the n-2 task cost. So basically what you compare is when you perform a task, you have 3 tasks to perform, right? And you can have switch, 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 switch. But this switch, you go back to this task here, right? So you have ABC or ABA. And many people have shown that ABA, it is harder than ABC. So, sorry, responding to this A is harder than responding to the C. And the reason is that you have to record from the inhibition that you apply here when you switch from A to B. You're looking like it's too early. You need coffee. Well, bear with me. The idea is that to switch to a task that you just abandoned, it is harder than to switch into another task. And that's basically what they found. They found that larger switch costs, a -2 cost for bilinguals than for monolinguals. And this is, I was a reviewer of this paper, and I thought, this is cool, this is very well done. I asked them to do the same study, N-2, N-1 together, but they didn't want to do it, so we did it. That's what we got. So again, a bunch of monolinguals, a bunch of bilinguals. We didn't get an N-2 cost. This is not significant, it was the same result, okay? And also, in this study, we mix. So we did 2 studies, one only looking at N-2, and another study looking at N-2 and N-1 in the same experiment. And again, we failed to find significant differences. So, I think that people should, I think that people should pay attention to this and try to see whether we can have ways of getting at it and whether this is correct or not, because I think it would be informative. And that there are other studies, and Andrea Philip, and I have done other studies on this issue. All right. However, here comes the problem again. When you ask participants to do this language switch task, executive control task switching, and you look at their brain activity, sometimes we find some differences between the brain areas that respond more in the case of bilinguals and in the case of monolinguals. This is a paper we published a number of years ago in which we found that the larger activation discriminating switch and non-switch trials was in left inferior frontal gyrus for bilinguals, and it was in right inferior frontal gyrus for monolinguals, right? Suggesting that there is some difference between the networks that are involved, and this has nothing to do with efficiency. It's just, that you recruit areas that are, to some extent, different. Now, potential limitation, we didn't have a switch cost behaviorally for the bilinguals. So the task, who knows what they were doing, right? The task was too easy or something went wrong here. Now, this is funny because when you do neuroimaging studies and then you want to look at differences between conditions, people tell you it's very important that there are not behavioral differences, right? Because if you do have behavioral differences, then you don't know how to interpret the difference in brain activity. But then again, you're comparing different conditions because you think they're going to have differences in behavior, right? So, yeah, it goes both ways. All right, and let me finish with this study. This study, again, is a study that we look at task switching, a different type of task switching, and we get more activation, actually, in the left caudate for bilinguals than for monolinguals, and also in the left inferior frontal gyrus. Now, here it is. I don't know. I mean, it's not that I'm a neuroscientist, but I don't understand very well how to interpret more or less activation. I mean, sometimes more activation seems to suggest that area is more recruited. Now, sometimes less activation seems to suggest that people are recruited to the same extent, but they are more efficient. So, not sure how to interpret that, but that's basically what we obtain. And that's nice because the caudate has been, and it's certainly left inferior frontal gyrus have been related to language control very often. And this is a task that does not involve language control. All right, so let me finish, let me wrap up this, and you know already the question. What are the common mechanisms between domain general control and bilingual language control? And this was my theoretical model. We have this approach we took, and again, the answer is the one I gave you, just in case you wanted to leave the room. So this is a difficult issue, difficult topic, and And in a way, I think we should go back and look at more brain damaged individuals and see whether we can find striking dissociations there. Because the consistency of the neuroimaging data is sometimes not so large, not in this field, in any field, and the consistency of the behavioral results are also sometimes for the relationship of executive control to bilingual language control, the link seems to be more elusive than when we would like to be. This is the group. There are many other people involved. There are people, certainly Jubin Abutalebi in Milano and Cesar Avila in Castellón, that they are involved in the neuroimaging data. And that's about it. Thank you very much.
We did yesterday. We won't have any questions now. We'll have questions at the end after the discussion. So our next speaker is Raymond Klein.